food. Present forward. Sir, the colors are present.
Post the colors.
Order, forward.
You will join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of our country. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Brother Davis, would you please lead us in singing our national anthem?
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watch were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Order, forward. Forward, forward. Right food. Forward, forward.
You may be seated. How quickly I forgot my script and all the patriotic emotions. The colors were presented tonight by the Trumbull County American Legion Honor Guard. And I forget how many funeral services they've performed for veterans this year. It's in the neighborhood of 247, I believe. Somewhere in that neighborhood. And as a matter of fact, they were on a funeral detail today. Good evening again. My name is Ron Gordon. I'm a member of the Valley of Youngstown. And on behalf of the officers and members of the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite here in this temple, we welcome you, all of you, Masons, Scottish Rite Masons, and veterans all. Tonight, before we begin the video and our speaker, I want to acknowledge a couple of real special veterans. So if I could have Brother Bob Bishop and Brother Al Gaskell please rise. These two brothers are a member of the Valley of Youngstown, and they are Pearl Harbor survivors, which began our entry into World War II. A hearty round of applause for these two distinguished veterans. Thank you, Brother Gaskell and Brother Bishop. You remain standing, if you would, please. Would the World War II veterans please rise? Okay, a nice round of applause for our World War II veterans. It's good to rehearse, you know. And now, without reading my notes, we want to remember the veterans of the, quote, forgotten war. Would our Korean War veterans please rise to be acknowledged? You're a great audience. I don't have to prompt you for a round of applause. That's a good deal. It's a great deal, as a matter of fact. Now, for Vietnam era and Vietnam vets, would you please rise? Thank you very much. I see the majority are Vietnam era or Vietnam vets. And tonight is a special night for the Vietnam era and the Vietnam vets, as our program is aimed predominantly at your service. And I was expecting some of the younger veterans here tonight. Are there anyone here who served in Iraqi freedom, Iraq, or Afghanistan? If so, would you please rise? Okay, thank you very much. As you probably imagined, our speaker tonight is former Major Thomas A. Ross, who's sitting off to my immediate right. And I'd like to read a brief bio of Tom Ross. What an interesting life this man has led. Tom Ross was raised in Pensacola, Florida, where he lived and attended college until he enlisted in the United States Army. Tom's commitment to both community and country were apparent long before entering military service, when at a young age he earned the rank of Eagle Scout. Compelled to serve at a time when our country's involvement in the Vietnam War was escalating, Tom first thought about serving as a military pilot since his father had flown with the 8th Air Force during World War II. After passing the required aptitude and physical tests for Army Flight School at Fort Rucker, Alabama, Tom was accepted for flight training and assigned a class date, 90 days away. Feeling he couldn't wait 3 months to begin his military service, Tom opted to decline flight school and left college to attend the United States Army as an enlistee in 1966 with the rank of private. Completing basic training, ranked #1 scholastically, and as a result he was sent to Army Leadership Training School, where he was named honor graduate. Before completing his next assignment at Advanced Infantry Training, AIT to you military types, Tom was accepted into and immediately sent to OCS, where he received a commission as second lieutenant. Upon graduation from OCS, Tom applied for and was accepted for training in the U.S. Army's Elite Special Forces, also known as the Green Berets. After completing more than a year of intensive unconventional warfare training, he was assigned to an operational A-Team, Detachment A-502, with the 5th Special Forces Group in South Vietnam. Ladies, gentlemen, and veterans, our speaker tonight, Major Thomas Ross. Thank you for being here.
I'm going to adjust this because whoever did the invocation, I'm also standing. We've got a video to show. It's an interesting video. And it was put together originally to be shown at a reunion of the 281st Assault Helicopter Company reunion in St. Louis. What you're going to see are acts by a group of very courageous men, and I'm going to tell their story, but Randy, if you would, go ahead and run our video.
More than 3 million American men and women served in the Vietnam War, and more than 58,000 died or were declared missing in action. Most of those who served during one of the most controversial periods in American history did so with honor and distinction. Finally, there is a book that shares a positive perspective of service in South Vietnam. Privileges of War is a non-fiction work that captures the good in the American spirit, similar to the way other books and movies have shocked us with its evil side. The stories told here are relatively simple and straightforward, but they are also powerful, with the potential of changing viewpoints, opinions, and even lives. Privileges of War tells factual stories of dedication, selflessness, and American patriotism, as witnessed through the eyes of a young Special Forces officer. This book provides a detailed, action-filled account that will give readers a real, often frightening idea of what it was like to be on the ground or in the air over the Vietnamese jungle during that conflict. But more importantly, it reveals the true character of those who bore the burden of fighting an unpopular war. Privileges of War also offers inspiration, with an untold account of a daring intrusion into enemy territory. The book climaxes with this story of a small team that, demonstrating uniquely American values, dared to attempt the rescue of families held hostage in the Valley of the Tigers. With its telling of positive stories about men and women who served in South Vietnam, the goal of Privileges of War is to add a vital piece to the American historical puzzle.
From our newsroom in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Eric Severide in Washington, David Culhane in the Valley of the Tigers, South Vietnam, Bruce Morton in San Diego, California, Ben Silver in New York, and Charles Kuralt on the road, tonight in Jamestown, Colorado.
One of the more unusual Allied operations in recent months took place a few days back in a Viet Cong area 30 miles west of Nha Trang, called Valley of the Tigers. CBS News correspondent David Culhane was there.
This is Viet Cong territory. Ordinarily, there isn't an American or a South Vietnamese soldier within miles of this spot. But this Special Forces unit was brought in here by helicopter to perform one of the most dangerous mercy missions of this war. To rescue some mountain people, or montagnards, being used as slave labor by the enemy. Air Force planes fly overhead to broadcast to the montagnards and alert them to the chance for escape. The mountain people are usually not under direct guard. The Viet Cong simply close all the passes out of the valley to keep them working on these small hillside cornfields. These South Vietnamese soldiers lunched on the enemy corn while they waited for the montagnards to come in. Cornfields like this can be found along most of the infiltration routes used by the Viet Cong. With Viet Cong in the area, time is running short.
Contact 2-2 and tell him there are 27 VC between him and us. They're NVA with him. If you roger me, raise your hand.
Efforts are made to get the VC to surrender.
They're up on the hill there. Tell him there are VC up there, too. They've already called us. They see the VC. Tell him to call the VC in. The VC can come in. We treat them number one, too. Tell them to come in, bring their rifles, come in. We give them food, water, everything.
At the worst possible moment, one of the broadcast units goes out of action. But the others continue to work, and finally the 2nd Special Forces unit, sweeping toward this position, starts coming in with the freed montagnards. The first man to arrive is greeted by a brother he has not seen in all the long months of his captivity. These people have been forced to grow corn for the Viet Cong for years. They've been ordered to save a certain portion of their crop for the infiltrators as they come down the valley leading east to the sea. These people have just walked for 3 hours through the mountains to get to this landing zone, so there's little doubt that they want to get away. They'll be taken to a refugee camp for montagnards at Nha Trang. Lieutenant Thomas Ross was in charge of the rescue operation on the ground. How many people do you think you were able to bring out now?
Right now, up to date, we've got a total of about 165.
These are all montagnards.
Right, they are montagnards who have been in the area under VC control now for the last 8 years.
Just as the montagnards were airlifted out, the Viet Cong began to come within range of the landing zone on higher ground. Gunships were called in to rake the whole area with rockets and the high-speed machine guns called miniguns. This fire suppressed enemy action long enough for the two Special Forces combat platoons to get away. This is a rare occurrence in this war, an act designed to give life and freedom in a place and time noted mainly for death and destruction. David Culhane, CBS News, in the Valley of the Tigers.
Fighting soldiers from the sky, fearless men who jump and die, men who mean just what they say, the brave men of the Green Beret, silver wings upon their chests. These are men, America's best. 100 men we'll test today, but only 3 win the Green Beret. Trained to live off nature's land, trained in combat hand to hand, men who fight by night and day, courage take from the Green Beret, silver wings.
When we did the video, or when they did the video, this last part, and they asked for permission to use the CBS piece and so on and so forth, I said, if you put at the end that it was dedicated to you. First, I'd like you to know what a great honor it is for me to be here this evening in the presence of so many who have served our country. And I'm always pleased to see family and friends, because it's often those closest to our veterans who have no idea the things they experienced, only because they don't talk about it. In my role as the Operations and Intelligence Officer of Special Forces Detachment A502 in Vietnam, I worked with individuals from every military branch and array of civilian organizations. While doing my job, I witnessed deeds of courage and selflessness by good men and women. So when I returned to the U.S. and heard that American civilians were spitting on the uniforms of American soldiers, I could barely believe this was happening in my country, and I must tell you, it made me incredibly sad. It was at that point that I decided to write the book. Within 2 weeks of returning, I wrote the first few pages, an entire outline, and I closed with the rescue you just saw. Now, something interesting about the video we watched, as I told you, it was originally prepared by and for the 281st. In my book, the rescue comes at the end. But because of what we're celebrating this evening and who we're celebrating, this is a perfect place to begin. 2 weeks ago, I was invited to speak at the Airborne and Special Operations Museum at Fort Bragg. The occasion was to dedicate a memorial to the 281st. The memorial was to recognize the 281st as the U.S. Army's first Special Operations helicopter unit. This was a tremendous honor for these men, and credited the 281st for being the forerunner of modern-day heliborne special operations. The reason I was invited to speak was because of my role at A502. The 281st was one of our support units, so I had firsthand knowledge of their achievements and accomplishments. But of all the things I know about the 281st, the one that amazes me still, even today, was their age. When they were flying and I was riding in this mission, at least one of the pilots was only 19 years old. and one of the door gunners celebrated his 18th birthday on the day of the mission, which meant the day before he was 17 years old. That doesn't happen anymore. About 3 years ago, the book had been out for about a year, and I got a phone call, and it was from a gentleman named Paul Greiner. And he said, "Mr. Ross?" And I said, "Yes." We're both in our 60s now. He calls me Mr. Ross. He informed me that he was the young man, or he was young at the time, that celebrated his birthday on that operation. He's had a whole lot more since then. And he said, "You know, because of what we did that day was the greatest birthday I've ever had." Says something about not just his character, but the character of the men and women who took part in that war. In the video you just saw, it seemed that the rescue was pretty much over. And David Culhane's line at the end about what happened in a war that most of us remember very negatively was such a good thing. But it wasn't over. I was still out there, and I was down checking the perimeter. The helicopter you saw hovering as he did his report took off and flew some of the few remaining troops back to our camp, and then went to refuel. Unfortunately, that helicopter and the others that were supposed to extract us became grounded in the city due to a heavy rainstorm. For me, this is where the rescue really became interesting. And when that last scene was being shot, as I said, I was down in the jungle. When I came up, I was surprised to see David Culhane and his two CBS counterparts still there on the landing zone. When I asked, "What are you doing here, and why haven't you gone?" he said, "Well, I told you, I wanted to cover this mission up until the end." I laughed and said, "Well, you may be covering it up to the bitter end." And at that point, I explained that there were 12 combat soldiers left where we were. There were 10 Vietnamese soldiers, 1 American advisor, and me. Somehow he missed the other 100 troops being flown out. Then I gave him the really bad news. I explained that I'd received a radio relay message from our camp telling me that the extraction helicopters were grounded by bad weather, and it was very likely that they wouldn't make it back, in which case we would be moving off the mountain down into the jungle where we would spend the night, and then at first light we would walk out. And I don't know if you noticed, but the terrain was incredibly rugged, and it was a lot like you'd find in the Appalachians. It was amazing, and then covered with jungle. When the reality of the situation sunk in, you could see the color drain from his face. He walked a short distance to his crew and told them what I just told him. There was a little anxious back and forth conversation. Then he walked back to me and said, "Lieutenant, this film is extremely valuable. It's very important that you get us and this film out of here." I laughed and assured him that I would do my best to get him, his film, and the rest of us back to camp as soon as I could. It was less than 2 hours before dark, and I felt reasonably sure that we were going to be spending the night deep within enemy territory. And I must confess, I wasn't particularly excited about that prospect, because now not only was I responsible for my own safety and my team's safety, but I was responsible for an unarmed TV crew. And if you think back to the video, the helicopter gunships were firing at enemy positions, and they were only a ridge line away. And if you remember when, at the point where there was a count, we'd received a message that there were they'd cited at least 27 VC soldiers. Well, at that point, I already knew we were outnumbered 2-1. Still wasn't a fair fight. They'd have to find more men, but wasn't a fight I was looking forward to. My hope was that they didn't really realize how few of us there were. I'm sure you've all heard the expression, things can always get worse. Well, they did. The rain closed in, and originally our camp We were here, our camp was here, and the helicopters were here. The rain became so strong that I couldn't even reach our camp. So we became totally cut off and on our own. Occasionally I tried to reach my camp for word of our ride until it seemed clear that darkness would arrive before the helicopters. I gave the instructions to gather gear, pulled in our security, and started down the mountain. As we moved, I radioed my camp in the blind that we were on the move so they would know we were moving and where we were headed, but I received no response. We'd only gone about 100 yards when my radio started to crackle, and I thought I heard my call sign, which was bunkhouse 02. It sounded as though somebody was trying to reach me, and as I listened, I could tell that the signal was growing stronger, but it didn't sound like a radio man back at camp. When I answered with my call sign, the response came back, 02, hold your position. This is Bandit Leader, and we are inbound to your location. That was great news. When I looked out across the sea of swirling clouds before me, I couldn't believe how this was possible. Later I learned how it was possible. The helicopters had taken off in a storm and headed west. They were flying low over the Songkai River because they knew it would take them in the general direction of where we were located. When the pilot came back on the radio, he said they couldn't see very well, had no idea where they were, and told me to look for them. So I did. I started, and everyone else started looking for them. As I said, the sky was filled with gray clouds, but there were breaks here and there, and the storm had broken where we were, and the last rays of the setting sun made it through some of these openings and illuminated little spots here and there. I happened to be looking at one of those spots, and from that tiny opening came a spiraling flash reflected off the windscreen of one of these helicopters. Hollywood could not reproduce what I saw. It's as if God put his hand in this mission. I immediately radioed the lead chopper to turn south, and they did. They were army green, but to those of us on the ground, they looked like great silver eagles as they settled in to pick us up. Oh, and something I didn't mention. As I was directing the helicopters into our location, I was also receiving word from a two-man advance unit headed down the mountain that they had seen an enemy patrol at the base of the mountain. So if the bandits, as they were known, hadn't come back for us, things could have become very different, very challenging, and the day could have ended very differently for us, and there might be a different speaker here this evening. I'm not counting, but that was 41 years, 2 months, 3 weeks, 4 days, and about 4.5 hours ago. The men who came back for us were incredibly courageous, and you're going to get to meet some of them this evening. It is to honor men and women like these, and you, the veterans here this evening, that brought me from Atlanta tonight. And make no mistake about it, a woman can be every bit as brave as any man I've ever met. I know, I have a wife and 3 daughters, and none of them are intimidated by the fact that their father and husband is a former Green Beret. You may not have noticed, but you saw a woman in this video tonight. Randy, were we able to tag that? I would gladly point her out if Randy can find her, because I will never forget her. Okay, we're close. Stop. And now I'm going to tell you about this gal. She was the only female in a group of media personnel who had heard about the rescue and been permitted by Special Forces headquarters to cover the operation. When the group arrived very early that morning, I noticed a female reporter, and my first thought was, I wonder if she thinks she's going with us. After greetings and brief introductions, I took her aside, and our exchange went something like this. I started by giving her a quick briefing on the operation and suggesting that she go over to the area where we were going to be taking the mountain yards so that she could begin her story. She said, "Oh no, I'm going with you." I said, "No, you can't go." Pointing to the male reporters, she said, "Are they going?" I said, "Yes, they are." She said, "And why can't I go?" I said, "Because you are a woman and because I would be concerned that something might happen to you." She said, "Are you not concerned that something might happen to them?" Well, you can see where this is going. There was more back and forth, with her responding intelligently to every excuse I had for her not to go. Finally, I said, "Look, I grew up in the South where I was used to seeing women in frills and not on a battlefield. I'm truly concerned that I would be distracted from doing my job if you were out there." And I was being very sincere. I mean, if men in this crowd stop and think about it, you don't want to think about a woman being hurt. And seeing her down, I mean, I felt that I would be watching her all the time. As I said, I've got 3 daughters. But what I now know, and we see it today as women want to serve their country. I don't know how, I wouldn't want them to, but I don't know how I could tell one of my daughters she couldn't serve her country if she felt that's what she wanted to do. Anyway, this gal looked me dead in the eye and didn't say a thing for a minute. So I thought, I've won. But as everyone here knows, the worst thing a man can ever do is to think he's won an argument with a woman. She took a deep breath and stomped her foot and said, "Look, Lieutenant," I don't think I've ever heard the word lieutenant used as a dirty word, "I'm no Scarlett O'Hara. I can handle myself as well as any of these men." Now, what was really very interesting, but where I'd taken her, I was here, she was here, and the male reporters were only about 10 or 15 feet away. So they could see this engagement taking place, and they're making faces at me. Well, I wasn't about to smile or smirk because she was already angry. Anyway, her last line was, "And I can handle myself as well as any of these men." It was time to take off, so I said, "At this point, I don't doubt that, but for the good of this mission, you'll have to stay here." With that, I turned, gave the direction to load helicopters, and went to get on the lead ship. As we lifted off, I looked back down the runway. She was standing with her arms folded in a very fixed position and was staring straight at me. It was clear she wasn't very happy. But knowing that she was safe on the ground, I was able to turn my attention back to the mission. After our position on the mountain was secured, I gave the all clear for the media helicopter to land. And as most of you know, or can imagine, when a helicopter is landing, dust, dirt, grass, and everything else around is blown with great force. So I typically flipped my collar up, turned my back, and knelt down, which is exactly what I did when the media helicopter came in. As it lifted off and passed over me, I stood up and turned around. And when I did, can anyone in this room guess who was standing in the middle of the settling dust? Thank you. There she was. I immediately started walking towards her, but before I could speak, she said, "It's my job to be here, just like it is theirs. Please don't send me back." I was truly concerned about her safety, but I was so taken with her tenacity and her courage that I did indeed let her stay. And so there you see her, an unarmed woman with her camera hanging around her neck in the middle of nowhere. Every other man is fairly heavily armed. I never saw her again after that day, but as I said, and you can see, I'll never forget her. She taught me how brave a woman can be. As I think about the brave men and women who served our country, I could tell you about the Marine pilots who came to my rescue when I was pinned down by enemy fire. I could tell you about the artillery battery that fired for me in the middle of one night. And these are men, I don't know if there's anybody from artillery here, but as a did I hear artillery? Thank you, sincerely. One night, I got a radio message that my best friend, and when this came over the radio, they came and woke me up. It was about 1 or 2 in the morning and said, Lieutenant Phelan is in contact, which meant he's shooting at somebody and somebody's shooting at him. I went to the radio room and tried to raise him using his call sign and got no answer. Finally, when he did answer, every time I could hear his mic squeeze, you could hear gunfire in the background. Finally, when he came on the radio, and Bill had first been a non-commissioned officer, then an officer. He was a very experienced soldier, so I knew when he came on the radio and said, Tom, we're not going to make it out of here, that he knew and thought he was in very deep trouble. This artillery battery fired, actually 3 artillery batteries fired in the middle of the night and saved my friend's life. Or I could tell you about the helicopter pilot who saved one of our long-range Special Forces patrols. Special Forces soldiers would go out in 2s, 3s, 4 on long-range patrols searching for enemy positions, and then they would report back. Often when they reported back, they were being chased by the enemy units who had seen them. The men were along a river and had been nearly encircled by the enemy. And the extraction helicopter, the jungle was so thick he couldn't get into them. So the pilot, refusing to let these men die, flew to an opening over the river, lowered his helicopter through the opening. Stay with me on this, the visual is incredible. Lowered his helicopter down to the surface level of the river, went up the river under the trees to the position where these men were, hovered long enough for them to get on board, turned his helicopter around, and came back out and left through the opening. This man was a member of the 281st Assault Helicopter Company. He was put in for the Congressional Medal of Honor, but because nobody died that day, he was given the Silver Star. I think everybody on board, everybody involved in that operation, were just as pleased that he only got the Silver Star. As I said, that man was a member of the 281st and is a perfect example of why the 281st has been referred to as God's own lunatics. And I think you may have seen that phrase on the video. And I, for one, when they came after us, was very pleased that they failed to follow regulation if it interfered with the completion of their mission. I think they told me once they thought the regulations were simply guidelines. I know everyone in this room who receives email has received one at one time or another that says, best one ever. Well, related to why we're here this evening, I may have truly received the best one ever this past Friday, and some of you may have already seen it because it was the definition of a veteran, and it is that time of year. And according to the definition, a veteran is someone who, at one point in his or her life, wrote a blank check to the United States of America, payable for an amount of up to and including my life. Regardless of your rank or job title, when you put on an American military uniform, you become the enemy of some and a hero to others. And putting on that uniform can require some to pay the ultimate price. I could easily spend the evening speaking about the brave men and women who have served our country, but I won't. Actually, I'd like to spend time with some of you. But I will tell you briefly how the rescue began. One day in August of 1968, a mountain villager named Mang Quang arrived at one of our outposts. The outpost called me and said they had a man who was asking for help for his village. Through an interpreter, he told me how his village, located in the mountains far to the west, had been taken over by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers. The villagers were forced to grow crops and serve as pack animals and to move military supplies. There were even stories of abuse of women and children. Mang Quang said that his resistance had been such a problem that the enemy soldiers had kept him caged at night as an example to the others. Rather than killing him, they caged him. A few days earlier, he had convinced the overseer that he'd learned his lesson and would do whatever they asked of him if they would let him out to work the crops. Typically, those working the fields would sleep away from the main camp and away from enemy eyes. The camp overseer, though, wasn't a dumb man. He told Mang Quang he had permission to work the crops, but told him he must report back in 3 days. Because of the remote location, as you saw, in the middle of nowhere, and you hear war stories, here's proof of what this unit did that I'm telling you. The overseer told him he had to be back in 3 days. Because of the remote location of the village, the overseer knew that Mang Quang couldn't summon help and return in 3 days. To ensure that he didn't attempt to escape, the overseer told Mang Quang that if he did not return in the allotted time, his family would be killed. The frail mountain villager took my hand as he pleaded for help. As his story continued to unfold, I recognized almost insurmountable problem, or an insurmountable problem. There were many. This was one. The overseer had given Mang Quang his 3 days to work the fields before returning. The problem was it had taken Mang Quang 2.5 days to walk to our outpost. Even if we left right then to attempt a rescue, it would have taken me and our response team the same amount of time to walk back. As I considered all the challenges and all the dangers in attempting any type of rescue, there was only one real possibility. We would have to fly to the village if there were going to be any hope to rescue Mang Quang's family. So, as I often did when I needed to get somewhere in a hurry, I turned to the 281st. Not surprisingly, there was a problem. Another one. Based on my conversation with Mang Quang, I was quite certain the village was situated far outside of our area of operation. As a consequence, the 281st would not be obligated to support that mission. But knowing the unit's reputation for disregarding regulations, I got on my radio. When I reached the radio at the 281st, or the radio man at the 281st, I began my story. After a few minutes, the young-sounding voice asked if I could wait one, which to you ladies means, can you hang on a second? A few minutes later, the same young voice asked if I could start over. So I did, and I assumed others had been summoned to the radio room to hear my story. So as I retold the story, I was brutally honest, because this was going to be a dangerous mission, and lives would be placed at risk. As I outlined the mission and the assessment of the unknown dangers, I knew all of the things that were running through the heads of those on the other end of the radio because they'd already gone through mine. I haven't mentioned this before, but I was 22 years old at the time. All I could think about was, what if that was my family out there? So what do you do in the face of such a situation? Well, I'll tell you what you do. If you're wearing an American uniform, you go after them. After a brief pause, a different voice came on the radio from the 281st, one that I assumed was the unit commander or a senior pilot. His message was short. Tell me where you want us to be and at what time. So very early the next morning, as the mist was still rising off the jungle, the 281st Assault Helicopter Company dropped out of the sky and deposited troops from A502 on the mountainside. As a direct result of their disregard for personal safety, 165 mountain villagers were carried to freedom by the men of the 281st. The oldest person to be liberated was a woman in her 80s. The youngest was a baby that had been born the day before. In closing, I want you to know that one of the most amazing things about the men who performed these deeds years ago is that if you met them today, you might not guess these deeds were a part of their past. The 19-year-old pilot who wore a Hollywood-style .45 caliber shoulder holster the day he boldly landed his helicopter in the middle of nowhere to rescue villagers, he is now an ordained minister. And I'd be willing to bet that few, if any, of his parishioners know this story. The crew chief, who sat behind twin machine guns and was on board the helicopter that came back after me in a driving rainstorm, is a soft-spoken business owner from Lordstown, who at Christmas time dresses up as Santa, travels around the country doing good deeds. Veterans, ladies and gentlemen, it truly gives me great pleasure to introduce true heroes, your neighbors and near neighbors, some of the men of the 281st and men who are extremely important to me. Please don't applaud if you're so inclined until I get them all up. There aren't many of them. Russ Irby, please stand. One of the men who made it possible for Special Forces to carry out very dangerous special operations and in many cases protected them while they were on those missions. Norm Kaufman. Norm is the 19-year-old pilot who is now an ordained minister. And Jay Hayes from Lordstown is the crew chief and one of the men who risked his life for mine. Please help me thank these men for their service to our country. Just goes to show you don't know who's living in the neighborhood. To all of the veterans here tonight, I must tell you it has been a tremendous honor for me to address you. Thank you.
Don't go away.
Okay. Thank you.
How do you top that? Jay Hayes.
I'm so thankful for Tom writing this book, coming up here at his own expense, and I talked him into bringing some books to Fort Bragg, and I picked them up and brought them back. They are all autographed, and I made up, we have 88, I made up 88 DVDs, like the one you just saw, and if you want afterwards, we'll be downstairs, and Tom won't collect the money, but I will. So...
Businessman.
Businessman, yeah. Agent. And so I've made it up, and I made a little after-mission report about the people that are mentioned in the book and the things. But on behalf of the 281st Association, to one of our honorary members, Mr. Tom Ross, I'd also like to give you this. Tom, thank you. It's been a great life. Thanks to you.
I feel like I need to be giving them a gift, and I hope you know
He
that.
came at his own expense. We didn't pay him anything.
Thank you.
Wow, that gets to you.